For the past 3 months, I've been working on my survival crafting game. Let me give a quick recap for everyone except the 45 people that saw the last video. It's a multiplayer survival crafting game set in ancient Europe. The gameplay is inspired by other survival games like Rust and Raft, with a specific focus on player physics interactions and ecosystem simulation. The idea is to have the players either working together to survive a hostile environment, or a balance between fighting each other and dealing with a hostile world. Now that that's out of the way, let me show you what I've done so far. Last devlog, this is pretty much what the play area was looking like when I left off. The game world felt awfully empty. There were really only 2 objects other than the cliff walls. The entire map consisted of a single flat, snowy plain with trees and boulders placed sporadically. This was enough for the game jam I originally created this game for, but I knew I was going to need a more interesting environment than this if I wanted to make an actually enjoyable game. I knew that I wanted the map to be procedurally generated because it adds so much replayability. Even though I know that a procedural map like something from Starfield can't compete with a handcrafted map from a game like Skyrim, I just love the concept of procedural generation for the environment. Ever since I first played Minecraft, the concept of a different world for every playthrough has always appealed to me. Plus, I don't think it matters as much in a multiplayer survival game as long as the procedural generation contributes to the gameplay experience. My first task on my checklist to procedural enlightenment was to make the forest feel more like an actual forest with tight clusters of impassable trees. That looked better, but obviously I don't want my game to be entirely impassable forest, and even though you can chop down trees, this game isn't about clearing a forest. Plus, that would be really boring. So I used a noise map to generate a forest with more natural looking clusters of trees. This new forest looked a lot better, but it's still a flat plain, which I think looks too boring from a first person point of view. It needs some form of terrain variation to serve as a landmark like a cliff or a valley. So I tried using Berlin noise again as a height map to create a more interesting terrain. I also made it so that trees will only spawn on the relatively flat terrain, so we don't have trees growing on sheer cliffs. These changes added the height variation I was looking for, but the height differences were way too extreme, and honestly this looked and played terrible in first person. Everything kind of blends together, and there aren't any easily identifiable landmarks to orient yourself. Also, with heights this extreme, sometimes the player or animals would get trapped in very small areas, which wasn't the intention. I could have just reduced the map height and ended up with small rolling hills like this, but I wanted something with more extreme differences. I wanted something like this, a river valley with high ridges on either side of it. When I found this video by Sebastian Legge, I decided that simulating erosion was the right way to go. So I tried adding it myself, along with a triplanar terrain material that would make the cliff edges gray. This looked way better from a distance, but from up close it still looked awful, and it played awful. And because I was simulating erosion, there was the issue of performance. So I actually ended up reverting back to a flat map with openings for meadows for now. With the improved environment, I expanded the map to form a giant 1000 by 1000 circle. Then I filled the map with a couple boulder prefabs that I bought off the asset store to make it look a little more interesting. Then I created a couple terrain prefabs to give some height variation so the world isn't completely flat. Then I kind of added procedurally generated rivers. Now that I had rivers, I had to add players swimming, and a nice little underwater shader to change how the water looks when you're underwater. Once that was done, I added cliff edges and mountains in the distance so the player had a skyline to look at. Then I opened up Blender again and modeled the cliff edge mesh that contains a cave in it for the player to spawn in, like a caveman. Also, I finally added a player model. I started with this free asset, but I ended up completely re-rigging him in Blender and created all new animations. Which leads me to the next section, gameplay updates. The first thing I did after animating my character was add ragdoll physics when the player dies. At this point, the player could only freeze to death, so I added in physics-based damage, which first was fall damage, where if you fall over a certain distance, you get knocked down, take damage, and then get back up in a nice little animation instead of just taking damage normally. Then I modified the trees to drop a full trunk just like in Valheim, and I made it so the trunk can knock you down and cause damage. With physics damage added, I needed to focus on the ecosystem simulation aspect of the game. I started by purchasing a couple animal models from the low poly pack, but I quickly realized I'd need more animations, so I completely re-rigged and reanimated the wolf and the deer. I wanted a hare in the game, but the asset pack only came with a rabbit, so I completely recreated a hair mesh from scratch. I also rigged my new hair mesh, which was a huge pain in the ass. I mean, look at this hair skeleton, man. This is not a serious animal. It has these tiny T-Rex-like front legs, and these ridiculously long toes. I couldn't figure out which joints were which. I must have spent at least a few hours watching National Geographic videos of hares walking and running on 0.25 speed to try and figure out how these little guys move.
Hares are notoriously sexy beasts.
Once I finished all the animations, I implemented some basic prey logic for the deer and the hare so they'll run from the player and the wolf if they get too close. Next, I wrote up some basic predator logic for the wolf and gave it a lunge attack. I also made the wolf target hares and deer to add some degree of emergent gameplay to start with. Now with hostile and friendly animals in the game, I added the ability to hunt animals and butcher their carcasses to provide meat and other animal products. Then I added logic to the player to keep track of hunger and thirst. And then I added the ability to cook meat at the fire and made river water drinkable. And with all that, I had all the core features that I wanted. Procedural environment creation, procedural rivers, physics-based damage, hunger and thirst, eating and drinking, hunting and butchering, prey animals, and predators. So I tested the game out and gave it a little playthrough, and it was terrible. The gameplay loop consists of running, chopping down trees, warming back up, and then running some more. The wolf by itself is way too easy to juke out, so it doesn't really pose much of a threat. The environment is overly simplistic with nothing to really look at. The game in its current state is a glorified walking simulator with nowhere interesting to walk to. But I think this is to be expected when I've just been focusing on the core features. Next video, I'll go into what I've done to try and make the game actually fun. If you find my game interesting, join my Discord to get updates on development and a chance to playtest. Thanks for watching.